There's a lot of companies with products solving problems for specific target markets that probably just shouldn't be product-led. Some of the common ingredients. One is that your product and use case can be adopted by an individual first, right? So they can get to that value by an individual. Second is that that individual can expand into a multiplayer experience. Three is that they can experience the value of the paid part of the product.
Welcome to Generation Builders podcast, brought to you by Softr. I'm your host, Mariam. The goal of the show is to unpack and share the superpowers and lessons of today's most successful software companies and discuss how the next generation will use and build software without code. I interview world-class product, growth, and community experts who help build some of the best companies of today. Hey Brian, excited to have you join us to talk about all things product and growth. Brian is the founder and CEO of Reforge and former VP of growth at Hubspot. He's one of the most prolific minds in the product-led growth era. He has built, scaled, and taught product and growth since early 2000s. Thanks for joining us, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
Do you mind sharing a bit about your background and what you are doing now at Reforge?
Yeah, so my quick background is I've been in tech for close to 20 years now. I started my career off as a product manager at a company called ZoomInfo, but I got quickly plugged into the startup ecosystem, and I started a company during the social gaming boom. The Facebook platform took off. That company name is called Viximo, and we ended up selling that to a mobile ad company called Tapjoy. I then went on to start another venture-backed company called Boundless Learning. We were trying to turn all of U.S. textbooks free. If you don't live in the U.S., it's like $4,000 per year for college textbooks. It's absolutely crazy. We developed this great product, this great process, and we just couldn't figure out how to monetize it. So we ended up selling that company to a textbook rental company, and then I spent some time at HubSpot, as you mentioned, as VP of growth there. Did really two things. This was kind of pre-IPO. One is helped them kick off their transition to a multi-product company. We had the marketing hub at the time, and my team helped start to develop the CRM and the sales hub. And then the second thing is they were a very marketing and sales-led motion, and helping them transition to a product-led motion, which I know we'll talk a lot about today. But during my time there, I started Reforge, which is really about how do we untrap all of this incredible knowledge that is trapped in the heads of the world's operating leaders and pass it down to the next generation so that they can really build on top of that. Right now, we do that through these form of very expert-led cohort-based courses with more to come soon.
Which are amazing, which I was part of and still learning a lot. And I'd love to dive in and take the listeners through your thought process of what is exactly the product-led growth and how can you apply it at every stage of the growth of the company.
Whenever something becomes popular, there's also this correlation with how much confusion and misconceptions kind of creep up with it. Those two things are very tightly linked. What I think one of the biggest misconceptions is people think about product-led growth as binary. You either have it or you don't. And it's not, right? You can think about all of the possible combinations of growth models, I think, on a spectrum. And if you think about on one side of the spectrum, there's like how much your product enables your users to drive growth, right? There's that's one end of the extreme. And then the other end of the extreme is what percentage of your growth is really driven by people in your company, primarily marketing and sales. The thing is that the companies live across all like parts of this spectrum. On that first end of the extreme, you can actually think of most consumer social products. Think like Snap, Facebook. Marketing and sales contribute almost, at least to the user side of the equation, like nothing to the growth. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got where it's almost all marketing and sales, something like Palantir selling to governments or enterprise product companies like Concur and Workday. But there's examples of successes that live across all the spectrum. And even more so, even more common today is that a single company can live on multiple parts of this spectrum. This is, I think, where a lot of the confusion comes from. So where on that spectrum is quote unquote product led exactly? Like where does it start and end? I have no idea, right? Like that I don't know. I don't know, but I think I would roughly say is that there are products that are more product led, meaning their users do more of the acquisition, retention, and monetization work than marketing and sales do. But it can be this mix and this combination of all of those things. In addition, right, you can have different levers that are product led and different levers that are marketing and sales led. So what I mean by that is that there's three parts to a growth model: how you acquire users, how you retain them, and how you drive monetization. So fully product led on all three of those levers would mean users are helping acquire other users. That's typically through some form of a viral loop. On retention, that's users are driving other usage. And then on monetization, that's users are purchasing fully without their own and their help. But there's a lot of products that are quote unquote product led on one or two of these levers, but actually more on the marketing and sales led on this side. And so it's less of a question of I think, am I product led or not as a founder and entrepreneur? And it's really just a question about what is the right growth model for my product and company where I'm at right now. And over the long term, what are the things that I sequence to and layer onto? Because most huge companies, once again, live across this entire spectrum. Zoom is a perfect example of that. They have components and tiers of their product that are fully product led. There are tiers and components of their product that are in the middle of that spectrum that I would call like sales assisted. And there are parts of their and tiers of their product that are fully driven by like marketing and sales, but it's everything. But most companies start at one part and then expand to other pieces over time.
Amazing, thank you. That makes total sense. Coming from what you just said, so how do you, if you just focus on the product, like typical product-led, more the user acquiring type early product-led process, how do you actually set that motion in the early days of the company?
I think first is you got to answer the question whether the use case and problem that your product is solving for and the specific target audience you're going after is well made for a full, like a product-led motion. What I see a lot of today, especially because of the macro environment and this pressure to make your growth model more efficient, is that there's a lot of companies with products solving problems for specific target markets that probably just shouldn't be product led, right? And they're gonna end up chasing that tail for a while, and it's not going to to end well.
It's not happening organically, right? You can't force that.
Yeah. So the ideal case to be fully product led on all three levers of acquisition, retention, and monetization. Some of the common ingredients. One is that your product and use case can be adopted by an individual first, right? So they can get to that value by an individual. Second is that individual can expand into a multiplayer experience, either with a team or other people. A lot of times that looks like things around collaboration and sharing. And three is that they can experience the value of the paid part of the product, self-serve without a lot of help. And you're able to price the product at an entry point where the friction is low enough that self-serve monetization is semi reasonable, right? And the key about this is that these three things depend on the type of person in your target market that you're going after. Atlassian is commonly used as an example of where they're fully product led on all of these fronts, even up into six-figure yearly deals. Now, the problem with that example is that it is fully the exception and not the rule. And partially that's because they are targeting a very specific audience, which is like autonomous engineers, right? And so engineers really dislike talking to salespeople. It typically hurts growth more than helps growth when they are like the sole decision maker and buyer. But for most other categories of the market, just as an example, once you get into 5-figure, 6-figure yearly deals, most other segments of the market actually want to and need a little bit of hand holding from the sales process to either give them comfort or help them understand the use case and the value of the product, right? So those are just a few of the common ingredients, but like I said, it can depend on the target market. I'll give one more counter example, right? So one more counter example would be, HubSpot was very marketing and sales led. The reason is that they were going after mid-market customers, so companies 20 to 2,000 people, with an all-in-one marketing value prop, meaning we could give you all of your marketing tools in one product versus adopting a bunch of disparate products. But what those two things meant were two things. One is that the product was actually not easy to set up and adopt. It took some time, number one, and to realize that whole value. And two, in order to make the economics work, it was priced around an average ACV of about $10,000 per year. And the target market kind of needed a little bit of handholding to see like both the value of the product and how to get that value in relationship to the price. And that's where they started. And now over time, they targeted other segments. They made other tiers of the product that became more quote unquote product led. But like I said, going back to the original thing is your fundamental question is just what is the right growth model for you versus how do I be product led, which can lead you to like very bad territory because maybe it's just not right for your product and your use case.
Right, exactly. And that is something we have also seen, in the newer generation type companies, meaning more customer built, which we will talk about in a minute, but more companies which have products which are not just one vertical type of solution, but rather the end user has to spend some time. So there is a lot of the education involved and also hand holding potentially to make them successful in your product, right?
That's correct.
So you have helped build so many amazing companies and invested in many great ones as well. Tell us a bit what's unique about this new generation of fast growing software companies. So you also talked a bit about growth. So what have they done and how do they operate that makes them different from all the others?
In every generation to be successful, you need to thrive in a new set of constraints, right? And so like every generation of software company is born out of an environment of a certain set of constraints at that time. And so, when you look at what companies are doing differently, it's almost always in response to those constraints, right? So part of the reason that things like the two like really trendy things right now are product-led growth and community-led growth, right? So why are those two things emerging? Like, what are the constraints? Well, for a while we operated in an ecosystem where you had these large distribution platforms like Facebook, for example. That ocean was massively rising, and there were efficient ways to tap into that distribution, right? Typically through like cheap ads,
right,
or things going things going viral on those platforms. Now, what ended up happening is a new constraint ended up merging, which those platforms ended up starting to plateau in terms of their total growth size, while like all of the competition that was competing for those eyeballs continued on a different trajectory, right? And those two things crossed where all of a sudden, like these ad platforms didn't become as easy and as cheap before. It was much harder to compete in the feeds and all of this thing. So all of a sudden, all of the companies had to shift to something else, some other way to in order to drive this growth. Or a different way to put it is that the types of companies that even were able to succeed in the new environment had to be of a specific type. And so as a result, you see the products that are really thriving are the ones that don't depend on those platforms, that have viral loops baked into the products or very specific collaborative use cases and scenarios. So things, like Figma, like Softr, like a lot of these other things. And that's why you see these things thriving in this environment. In addition, you all of a sudden had a new platform with a new type of feed, which was TikTok. And that has been a piece, but not the whole equation into this whole like movement around creator and community-led growth. It created new incentives. It was a new distribution mechanism, a new pool of people, which opened new doors to things. So those are essentially the biggest trends. We could talk about Web3, but that is a endless rabbit hole that I'm not sure you want to go down, and it's not one that I think is fully shaken out yet. And it has like a lot of dangerous things, but it is another area that is changing the constraints of the ecosystem and what can essentially like thrive in these new environments. But that's how I think about it, is like, what are the constraints of the ecosystem, and what do those constraints give an opportunity to, and what do they take away from at the same time?
Talking about product-led growth, you also slightly mentioned community-led growth. So what are actually, in the newer generation, maybe in the last like 5 to 10 years, companies that have emerged, what are the shortcomings of product-led growth? Being someone really, of course, passionate and teaching and growing lots of companies through product-led growth. However, what are some of the shortcomings of that kind of motion that you have noticed, that you would raise, that there is for some other types of companies, maybe especially if you focus around more horizontal products, where some of these things might not even, some of the motions and the tactics of product-led growth might not even work?
I guess I would first say is every growth model has strengths and weaknesses, right? And it's more the job to understand those strengths and weaknesses and figure out how to lean into the strengths and minimize the weaknesses. The chase for the perfect growth model is like it's a fruitless pursuit, and one that can be very, very frustrating. But I would say that the main con of things that are more on the far end of that product-led growth spectrum, especially in the SaaS world, is that they tend to be actually slower to grow in the initial days. And so the question is why? That's because, to be product led from an acquisition perspective, users helping acquire other users, you're typically relying on either a viral loop, a user inviting another user, or a user creating something like a template in Miro or other things, just to use other examples as products, and then sharing that, right? And which brings in another user. Now, the thing about those two loops is that they are a function of your existing active user base. That's how the math works, right? So you have 100 users, and every month or some time period, they are going to go through that loop a certain number of times, or even like a partial loop. And at the end of that time cycle, instead of 100 users, you'll have 110 users, right? Or something like that. I'm making these numbers up right now just to make the point, right? And so what you end up having to do in the early days is ending up to have to be very, very patient, right? And what in the challenge is that that patience doesn't necessarily fit with the VC timeline, right? Which most of these companies are funded by. And so you see all of a sudden all of this money, this time, this energy spent on things that are aimed at accelerating growth that aren't necessarily contributing to these core loops. A great example of patience, by the way, is Calendly, right? You look at that product, and it was part of the reason they didn't raise money, or they only raised like a little bit of money at the beginning or something like that. Zapier is another like great example of this.
I think Miro has also been raising only really late in their journey. Same with Airtable, I think, right?
Exactly. And so you just end up having to be much more patient in the early days now from that growth perspective. Notion is another great example. They built for a long time before that thing really started to click. But once it goes, right? Like you start to hit that inflection point, and it really starts to take off, and then adding other things to those tailwinds, it ends up just becoming easier and easier. And so the early parts of the life cycle of these product-led companies, in the moment, they look a lot slower. There's way more building that happens for these things to hit inflection points in order to get going. So that's one con. You mentioned horizontal products, right? Many of these products, a lot of the ones that we mentioned, Softr being one of them. The pro of them is that they can be used for so many things by so many different types of users, but that's also the con, right? And the con of it is that when it can be used for so many things by so many different users, you have a much harder time. Like, how do I message to all of these users on the homepage in one way, right? Or how do I build an activation experience that shows them the value of the product when they could use this for 250 different things, right? Like those things end up being really, really, really difficult. And so, as a result, like, rather than having like a simple acquisition and activation funnel, what you end up having over time is these more complex ones where people are entering through hundreds to thousands of more specific side doors rather than the homepage of the product, and you're activating them on these like very specific use cases. But that kind of goes to the first point, is those experiences take longer to build and to inflect.
It's like building 200 different GTM strategies or use cases, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's how it starts off, right? Like almost everything, you start off building these things manually, and then once you kind of really get going, you can start to automate these things and personalize this with code and software, right, and like all that kind of stuff. But look, like it takes a while, and so that ends up being the biggest con of these things, and it's why it's so important for teams in these early days to stay lean, keep the product velocity high, and be patient and not spend a bunch of energy and cycles, trying a bunch of things that don't really impact these, the core loops of your product.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. And that's something that we have also noticed while still building software, and on the process of even just the onboarding. Like it's always a hustle, and one of the biggest challenges of building this company, right? To understand how do you even structure your onboarding, or even just the messaging on the website, but even more so if users already thought this is something for them, they land into the product and there is all these possible things they can do, they just get stuck, right? They are confused and they don't know what to do.
And it goes through the whole funnel, right? It's like, well, once you get them on one thing, how do you get them onto the next thing?
Even if you activate them, if they start building something, how do they go to the next step? How do they continue doing what they wanted? And how do you even as a company understand what they originally wanted to do? Because also that's the difficult part. The same way is that as they are all the different types of users, different personas, then it's even difficult to understand who they are and what they are trying to build.
Yeah, so 100%. Yeah. The way to think about it is fundamentally different than vertical SaaS, where you can think through persona first perspectives. And I find in like horizontal ones, it's much more of a use case first perspective, meaning like, what are they using this product for? Are they trying to build their own like personal custom CRM? Are they trying to do something else? And it's way less about like what role they're in, what company size they're in, like all that kind of stuff. It's like what problem they're solving, and there could be 100 different types of people trying to solve, like a similar problem. But the thinking is very flipped, and that can be difficult for some teams.
Right, and so you touched upon a bit on different use cases and how to have these customers land on from 100 or 200 different doors instead of just one, direct website, and they know what to do. So what are some of other GTM tactics that you would recommend for these types of products, more build yourself type products that companies can use to acquire customers?
If we're specifically talking about horizontal, what every one of these companies end up doing is going through a life cycle within Reforge that we call company generated to supply generated to user generated. Right. So you can even think about this with a tool like Miro that has a pretty robust set of users kind of contributing different type of Miro like templates and all sorts of things that you can use. But that's not how it started. And if you try to start there, you typically end up failing. And so what you end up doing is you end up creating, these side doors, whether it's templates or something else, the company first. But what I mean by this, you, probably the founder or somebody close to you, is literally manually creating, creating these things, right? Zapier, for example, right? Like they did all of the integrations into their product themselves originally, right? And then eventually, once there's enough momentum and there's enough incentive, you can transition that to what we call supply generated. And supply can mean one of a couple things, but typically this means like some type of power user, not your like typical average user. So in Zapier's case, that was like other SaaS tools that wanted exposure. Now, all of a sudden they could say, hey, come integrate to us. Oh, hey, do a blog post about doing your Zapier integration, and we'll do a reciprocal blog post that you just added it, right? So like there's an incentive. There's incentive both ways. Or what I think Miro went through is they went from company generated to these like agencies that did like design thinking workshops and other kinds of stuff, where they just like took their work and created templates for the community for their exposure, right? So that's the second sequence. And then eventually there's enough incentive for user generated, right, for them to add scenarios in cases themselves, right? And so going back to the examples that we've been using, what Zapier did was that they users contributed different Zap combinations that they were using across different tools to cover a much longer tail of scenarios that them or the supply hadn't even considered. That's typically how you scale these things over time. And once again, trying to start with the end. The user generated tends to be like the right incentives. They just don't exist in the ecosystem yet. And so you never end up getting those things going.
So how do you also think the community and education fit within growth and what we discussed all about, all these different tactics? Should you even be investing in community? I think you're one of the best persons probably to talk about this, because also you have built an amazing community around Reforge.
It's funny, like I've gone as far to basically ban the word community inside Reforge.
Why is that?
It's one of my least favorite terms right now. I think we started this episode off saying that the more popular something becomes, the more confusing and misconceptions. And I think that is 100% true with terms like community-led growth. The problem with my issue with community is not that I don't want to create community. It's that it means something different to every single person. All right. So internally, when people start to talk about community initiatives, they think they're being clear, but what they're actually speaking, it's like somebody speaking a foreign language and the other person doesn't even know it. It's like people talking apples and oranges to each other, and they have no idea. So it creates all of this swirl and energy spent. And so instead, what I do is I ask people to, rather than use the word community, very specifically describe the user behavior that they are trying to create, as well as the business value that ties with that. So those are the two questions, right? And so, so first, like you as a company, you have to ask, is community a marketing or a product strategy? Because those two things are very, very different from each other. Are you using it as a marketing lever, or are you trying to use it as like a core value prop of your product? That's the business value of the equation. And then the second question is, what is the specific user behavior that you're trying to create that's both valuable to other people as well as generates that business value that you were trying to talk through? So sometimes, right, these just to show you how many different things community could stand for, it could be a user creating content. It could be a user helping educate another user on how to use the product. It could be a user evangelizing the product. It could be a user communicating or forming a relationship with another user in the product, right? The list goes on of like a million other things. And this is exactly why I think it can be confusing. And so I think most teams would benefit from not using the word community and be specific about the user behavior and business value that you are trying to create with the initiative, because all of those things are plausible, like they make sense to create. You know, a lot of times what people really want, you know, with community is for people to like evangelize the product for them, right? And so the question is, well, how do you do that, right? Like how do you actually do that? And what most people come to me are like, well, what if we do these like incentive referral programs and all that kind of stuff? And that is the last place you want to start. Really, the best way to create these things is probably one of three ways. I think the best way is what we were talking about before, which is just solve a problem that is inherently multiplayer for them, something collaborative. And they will spread the product for you naturally through the use of the product in them solving the problem. It won't even feel like they're evangelizing it as they're doing it. The second best way is just to solve a single player problem for them, but do it in a way that is like 10x surprising or like unique enough that they want to talk about it with other people. But one or more of those things has to exist. There has to be a huge delta from the previous solution, or there's got to be some surprising or unique, delightful element of this in order to generate it from it. And then I think the third best way is to build a narrative around your company that people love and buy into that narrative so much it almost becomes a religion, right? And they want to like tattoo it on themselves, and they want to like wear t-shirts on this, right? Like HubSpot was a big part of this, where they formed the narrative around, inbound marketing and customer love and all that. I mean, this all sounds common today, but that was created by HubSpot 10 years ago, right? By the marketing team, and was massively invested in order to do that. Once you have one or more of those things, then you can think about the incentives to help, kind of grease the wheel and juice it a little bit. But if you jump to that end point and try to like you start there, you're going to end up with a big ball of nothing. So anyways, one of those three foundational things needs to be there. None of them are easy. All of them are hard and require a lot of work.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, which essentially means, comes back to understanding your users and really creating the product and solving their needs. And then they will evangelize, right? They will talk about it. And then you just really need to nurture them and understand what is actually so if they are already creating content, just creating the space and creating the frameworks for them to help do even more and to make that process easy. You don't want to mention the name as its own community, as a separate kind of motion, but then how do you recommend the teams? How does that come back to the team structure, and how do you think about it in the company? So if you have a product, if you have community that is evangelizing, that is more coming to the point of product, I guess the product type community where they are using the product, they're happy sharing with others. How do you even then, what kind of structure you put in place in your team? Is it the product people? Is it community hire you bring to your team to help grow that even further?
One of the most common questions I get around any of this stuff is like team and org structure. People in your org should be a reflection of the strategy, not the reverse, right? So like you got to think through strategy first, then people second. And this kind of goes back to trying to get the buzzwords out of the equation and specifically talk about the type of user behavior and business problem and business value you are trying to create. And then work backwards to the question of, well, what types of skills are best, specific skills are best suited to create that user behavior and that business value? And then where does that fit best in the organization, right? So, yeah. And so a lot of times, so like going back to the community example, it all depends on where you are once again in that sequencing of like company to supply to user generated and stuff. Let's go back to Miro, and I'm in the supply generated phase, meaning like we as a company created a bunch of templates internally, but we see these power users creating some stuff, and I want to like help them turn it into templates that they contribute to the ecosystem and do it. So what skills are probably needed? What skills are probably needed to do that? Well, first is that I need to go out and find those power users within my product and have a sense of like what is great and good. Then two is like I need some process where I can like reach out to them and convince them of the value, right? And then three is that I probably need to reduce the friction for them to contribute. So maybe I'm helping them create the template initially. And then four is like, I want to make sure they see the reward. So I want to distribute their template to the user base. So when I look at those skill sets in the activities that they're doing, what that starts to feel like is some form of like customer outreach with some form of marketing, right? I'm like creating content and I'm like promoting it to my users and stuff. And so then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, that should live in marketing, right? Very, very specifically. But let's say I'm something like totally different, right? In the sense that, like going back to the Zapier example, which is like, okay, we're moving to the supplier or the supply generated part where I want other people to integrate to me. And one of the big levers that I've got to pull there is creating and simplifying like more APIs to get them to integrate. Well, that's very clearly a product and engineering task, right? So my point is like, you really got to think about the specific things that you want to create, then think through the skills, then think through where that sits in the org. But when people start with, well, I need a community-led strategy, and so therefore I'm going to go hire a community person, like what you could end up with is one of them, like million different types of people, and maybe you get lucky, but you probably don't. and then you end up with a mishire and things not working.
Yeah, which totally makes sense, right? What you're saying is essentially looking at the problem, trying to come from the problem side instead of just trying to create solutions artificially. If you are seeing a problem and you want to drive something through users, then especially at the early stages, everyone in the company can start doing that. And then when it comes to scale, already you learn how to do it, or you know this is working, then you can bring a bit more maybe concrete skill set to even help scale that.
And this is pretty universal, actually. With it's just like a good hiring practice. And sometimes what I tell my team internally is build the JD, the job description, inside out. And what I mean by that is usually as people try to write a JD, they're like, well, what should the title and level of the role be? And then it's like, well, what are the things that I want them to own and things I want them to do? And then what are the skills and the experience like I need them to create that? And that's exactly the wrong order to go through it. And it's more, you want to build that middle piece first. It's like, well, what goals am I looking for somebody to own, and what do I want them to create? Then you move to the last piece, which is like, well, in order for them to successfully do that, what are the skills and potential experience they need to have? And then you get to the top, which is like, okay, what is the title of that role? What level of person do I need? And all that kind of stuff. So if you want to think about it from that perspective, it's just like, build the JD inside out versus like going through sequentially.
Which also typically probably ends up someone in the team doing the same work, right? Understanding that inside out, and then that becomes a job description and hiring someone specifically. Last questions I wanted to touch upon a bit also on the trend that has come up in the last 2-3 years, which is called no code, and really curious to hear your perspective on that. So how do you think in general work and tools are changing in the modern organizations? And what's really the next phase of tools and products that will empower the individual knowledge workers to adapt their tools to their workflows, to build their own solutions, and to solve the problems that they're trying to solve? Because especially coming from Hubspot and all the other types of companies you have worked with, which are bigger and more, there's lots of vertical solutions to a specific problem. But nowadays, the also skill set and in the new era, there is so many opportunities for people to actually solve specific and smaller problems within the organization, and they are empowered to do so. Yeah, really keen to hear your take on that.
Yeah, this very much ties into what we talk about at Reforge, which is so many professionals spend so much time on figuring out like how to navigate their career, like how to grow a meaningful career. And the problem is that most of the advice and things out there is actually really bad, right? Like people end up chasing these like random certifications, right? Or, trying to just put the logos on their resume, and they think, that's the goal and that's what's going to like move people forward. But in the end, what tech is really showing is that it's none of that. It's about the people who, they're able to build, they're able to solve meaningful problems and create experiences for the customers and for the company. And that's what the companies want too. Unfortunately, that's just like not how history built up the ecosystem. We were sent to colleges. We were taught all we needed to do was get the badge
right?
on the resume, and everything would take care of itself. But I think people are starting to wake up to that. Additionally, right, you saw this, right, in the whole argument of 10x, or there was a whole wave. It kind of comes up every now and then of like, everybody should learn SQL, right, and all these things, and what you're really seeing is like, hey, the more self-sufficient you are as a person in creating one of these experiences, the higher leverage you are, because it's just, the more people, the more complexity, and the slower things move. Right. So if every time I'm trying to make a decision, I need piece of data, and I've got to put in a request to a data analyst, and they're prioritizing it in their pipeline, and then they turn around with the request and it's not exactly what I thought. And then there's this back and forth. Well, a month later, you might finally have your answer, and then you can go do that thing. Right. So it's the same thing with building, right? And building things. And as you've seen,
with every department.
salaries and compensation flow to the people that are part of like the building and the creation process. And so the problem is not everybody's going to become a master at SQL. Not everybody's going to become like a master engineer. And what I think you see with these tools is kind of what you said, which is it empowers people to be more self-sufficient, solve more problems, create more experiences with less resources in a smaller set of people. And that is a very powerful thing, not just for the individual, but for companies as well. And so ultimately, I think it's a very powerful trend and a very very powerful mechanism. And I think the reverse side of this is like, well, maybe these tools will be so powerful, like, we'll never need engineers and like all that kind of stuff. And that's not true, right? Like what these experiences are really going to look like is that, we'll start our knowledge off in these spaces with a set of like really easy to use tools that can create a limited set of experiences. And then we're going to be like, well, we want to create an even like deeper experience, and then we'll move to a more complicated tool all the way down the stack to, there's a certain segment of people that get all the way to the place of, wanting to learn to, code
coding,
the
exactly.
chips on the computers, right? Like that's how deep
Right.
deep this stuff goes. But enabling people across that full spectrum rather than this very binary thing of like, people who know how to code can build, and then there's everybody else. Like that's like the old world. Like that's like the old world that I think we're moving away from, and enables a much broader set of things.
Right, correct. And we see so many of our users as Softr are actually coming from someone being a doctor, someone being completely running their own business, offline business, and then all of them become creators, become the owners of their lives or their businesses, and they can now create their own tools, which is amazing to see. And as just to wrap up everything, and having discussed all this about product-led growth and community-led growth, which you don't like the word, where do you see the world will be in 10 years in terms of product and growth direction, and these different motions? Is there going to be a new trend or something else in 10 years?
There's always going to be a new buzzword. Right? There's always going to be a new trend. I have no idea what that's going to be in 10 years. My guess, but it's not my hope, is that it looks pretty similar to today, right? So if you were to look, 10 years ago, all these things that we're talking about actually existed. Like Dropbox was around and starting to grow, and they were like one of the first product-led growth models, right? So like all these different growth mechanisms have been the same. And once again, like bringing the conversation full circle, that's really driven by the reality of like how you get into in front of people, and like what the constraints are on those distribution platforms. And I think unfortunately 10 years from now, we're probably still looking at a world where there's a small set of distribution platforms like Google, like Facebook, like TikTok, whatever it is, like Twitter, that have, the majority of the eyeballs. It's just that sample of those few platforms might be a little bit different. And so rather than, I think what I encourage a lot of people to do is, like, rather than guess at what the future is, just get really, really good at understanding these platforms, what users are doing on them, and how you either build, buy, or partner, into those ecosystems. Like, if you just learn the skills of that, of like how to deconstruct these ecosystems and figure out how to like use them to your advantage. And that's what the best marketers do. That's what the best product growth people do are those things. Then it doesn't matter what it looks like 10 years from now, because like you're just going to roll with the tide, right? Like, and wave. Now, the one exception to this is maybe Web3 like changes this all. It still really has it still has a really long way to go into proving that it can actually essentially break these monopolistic ecosystems. And even when I look at Web3 and talk to a lot of Web3 companies, the growth mechanisms are exactly the same. It's just that the incentive levers behind them are slightly different, right? Like things around like tokenomics and stuff like that. So you will power your career by just understanding how to deconstruct platforms and understanding user psychology. And then 3, just having a diverse tool belt of tools how to use to create different experiences like Softr or other things. If you have those 3 things, you'll be able to navigate anything that comes over the next decade.
Thank you, Brian. I think that was a great closing. And thank you so much for the very insightful and interesting conversation. Where can people learn more about you and your work at Reforge?
Yeah, personal blog is just brianbalfour.com, and then reforge.com. If you want to learn how to execute on a lot of these strategies and go really deep, we have a number of programs across product growth, marketing, and engineering. Would love to have you all there.
Yeah, which are amazing. I can confirm all of our product and growth people have either gone through or are going through the courses.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Brian, for joining us.
Thank you.